Hi, I'm Will Bruin, and I was just recognized as a Seattle Sounders legend. Now I get to do voice reads for the Sounder at Heart podcast network.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Rui Diaz through the middle to crown it for Seattle!
The Sounders rule the region!
Seattle Sounders is campeón! All creatures great and small!
You know, what was the thought process in terms of who you decided to use and who you didn't?
Ever since Sounder at Heart wrote a commentary that we didn't take Gold Cup seriously.
This episode of Nos Arietes is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Arietes since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest. Welcome to another episode of Nos Arietes, part of the Sounder at Heart podcast network, sponsored by Full Pull Wines, Hacks and Ferments, and our subscribers. That's you. We're recording on Tuesday, September 30th. I am your host, Jeremiah Shan. Today, I'm joined by Sounder at Heart's Tim Foss, who's filling in for Aaron while he's on vacation, and Lickett is, of course, producing. Well, Tim, it was another frustrating result for the Sounders, a 2-2 draw against the Vancouver Whitecaps. It's now 4 straight since the League's Cup, 4 straight since they've won. I think they showed signs of life a little bit better, but yeah, just sort of another frustrating result in this one.
A particularly frustrating result because it felt for so much of that game for a good chunk of the second half, it felt like they were going to, break this streak, find their stride a little bit. And instead, another pretty frustrating, relatively soft goal to give up from a set piece. And, you settle for 1 point against a rival and one of the top teams in the West, and the rest of the season looks that much tougher, and hopes of making noise in the playoffs is a little bit dimmer, particularly with the injuries that they suffered.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, admittedly. May as well focus on this. One of the big things is that the result itself was disappointing. It, to the degree that there was really any hope of finishing 4th or better, it's effectively extinguished. So there's not really a viable path to getting home field in the first round. I don't know how much that was really changed by this result. But what's weird is they're kind of locked into spots 5, 6, or 7, and I guess it sort of depends on how the rest of the playoffs shake out. But right now, that would be a first round match with LAFC, or I guess with Minnesota United. I would take that. All things being equal, a best of 3 against Minnesota United. Granted, yes, they've beaten the Sounders twice. I wouldn't say either one of those was particularly convincing. And I still like that the Sounders, how they match up with Minnesota potentially. But if they drop down to 6, that potentially means that they have to face LAFC, which I think is probably the toughest draw. And then you also are, the farther you drop down, the more you're diminishing your chances of hosting in case of upsets in other parts of the bracket. But really, these last 3 games aren't so much about playoff seeding as they are just about getting right, showing themselves that they can win. And really, it sets up a huge, this game against the Timbers feels like a massive emotional game for the Sounders, if for no other reason that they still haven't beaten the Timbers at home since 2017. What the hell?
It's a really long time to go not beating your biggest rival at home.
Yes, it's like the most surreal stat.
As
Brian Schmetzer has only beat. Go ahead.
Just as if a Timbers match needed more emotional energy added to it and more riding on the stakes of that game.
Yeah, and it's, in a way, I guess maybe it's better there's not like a lot on the line, although I guess there's playoff seeding. The Timbers would jump the Sounders, although the Sounders would still technically control their own destiny, I believe, in the playoffs. If the Sounders finish tied with them, I think they would potentially still have the tiebreaker, and they have one more game. They have a game in hand. In any case, it doesn't put that aside. The Sounders just need to beat the Timbers for just to, it's funny because if they win this game, all of a sudden the vibes feel okay. It's almost like you're playing with house money at that point, because they will be almost assured of finishing fifth, which is really as high as they can finish. And it would just get the biggest monkey off their back if they can beat the Timbers at home. And this is a team the Sounders should beat. They should, like, you can't tell me. I realize that only 2 points separate them right now, but the Sounders feel like a much better team than Timbers, even if they are missing Alex Rodon and Yamar.
Right. Even on current form, I think that if you look at the two teams, the Sounders are clearly the better team. They're at home where they've, last couple outing. Yeah. The last couple outings aside, they've still been a very good home team. It would be a nearly perfect get right game because it will be a very much a playoff atmosphere. That game is going to or should feel like a playoff game as much as any not actual playoff game can feel like one. And if you get over the Timbers at home, you get that added boost of you broke this 8-year streak of losing to them or at least not being able to beat them at home. You get that win. You feel energized for those last two regular season games. The vibes definitely shift a lot based on one performance.
Conversely, if they manage to blow this game, the vibes are almost going to be like irreparably bad, seemingly. Like there's nothing they can do in the last 2 games of the season that can override the negative emotions, I think, that will be coming out of this game. And then it's really comes down to the playoffs, which is always a crapshoot. You don't want you don't want the success or failure of your season riding entirely on how you do in the playoffs. And I guess that's maybe unfair. We don't need to get into the whole, is this season a success thing? But the regular season at least would feel like a pretty big failure if they lose this game to the Timbers almost no matter where they finish.
Yeah. And I think looking ahead to the playoffs a little bit, if, particularly if you end up facing Minnesota, the struggles recently have largely been set pieces, transition play. That's for all that I generally like the Sounders against Minnesota in this particular phase for the Sounders. That's a looming threat. Although if you can get over that hump, you feel pretty good about what comes next, but you have to get over that hump first.
Right. Well, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about this Whitecaps game. It started pretty slow. Neither team really had great chances in the first half. I think maybe one of the better chances was a Albert Rusnak cross that found both Jordan Morris and Paul Rothrock making effectively the exact same run. Rothrock is the further forward of the two, and he ends up heading it essentially right at Takaoka. I think Morris maybe had a better angle on that shot, but either way, it gets saved. Not going to beat anyone up for taking a header in front of goal. And it really, neither team really controlled much of the game, but there was this sort of pall, or I shouldn't say that. The Whitecaps controlled most of the game. They didn't generate a ton of danger out of controlling the game, I should say. And the Sounders they did seem to be thrown off by the injuries to Alex Roldan and Yamar, both of which came inside the first 15 minutes. And Kalani Kosarienzi definitely struggled, I think, to get into the game. Kim Keehee was not as sharp as we're used to seeing him, which I suppose is understandable when he didn't get a proper warm up and everything. But that first half was really disjointed and not a lot to like, especially from the Sounders.
Yeah, I think you put it well in the post-game pontifications that both teams just seemed very much slowed down by the sequential breaks in play from those two injuries, and the Sounders were really trying to find their footing. And I think that, combined with just generally the way the Whitecaps set up to play, made for a very uninteresting and unexciting, I guess, first half where neither team really had much forward thrust. It was trying to establish themselves in midfield, more or less, and not really doing a great job of it from either side. I think for the Sounders, we were talking about it in the press box, but none of the forwards for Seattle really were able to have much of an impact. Jordan only played that first half. I know Schmetzer talked about the two injuries really changed the way they were able to utilize subs, that they wanted to have Jordan out there longer, but needing to use the halftime sub window so as to maintain sub windows for the second half. Jordan comes out early, but when your best look of a half is from a cross that maybe someone gets a good head on, just is not really setting yourself up to do a whole ton.
Right. I think maybe the stat that best illustrates Jordan Morris's first half was he had more successful duels than he had successful passes. I think you pointed this out to me in the press box, but he was only 2 for 8 passing, but he was, he wasn't inactive. He was 6 for 8 in duels. He was sort of doing the work. He just wasn't really, the Sounders were not getting him the ball in dangerous areas. He wasn't really, he just was really ineffective. And I don't necessarily put that on him, but either way, he just was not as involved offensively as anyone would have liked. But at the same time, Danny Musovski wasn't super active either. He had 14 passes, but he did not. He also had 8 duels. So both of them were both pretty comparable in that way. But yeah, neither one of them got a shot off, I don't think. Just not a great game. But the second half did start much more interestingly. And it wasn't necessarily a good thing for the Sounders because, well, I'll preface this as a little bit of foreshadowing. Early on in the game, the best thing that Jordan Morris may have done is that he drew a early foul on Mateus Laborda, who you could have argued should have been sent off in the second minute with a dog-so foul. Well, basically, he just grabs onto Jordan Morris to not let him get in behind. Now, I think if anything saved him, it was that the pass was maybe a little strong, and so maybe the referee was like, Morris wasn't going to get there anyway, but he gives him a yellow card really early in the match. I think in the second minute of the match. But then right at the beginning of the second half, Laborda does a similar play on Nuhu after he gets beat, and he does not get a yellow card for it, though. He just gets a foul. But that really should, to me, it looks like a stone cold yellow. This is like the third or fourth time this has happened to the Sounders where they seemingly get a second yellow on a player on a very similar play, like a professional foul, and referees just do not want to give this foul to the Sounders. Although the Sounders have been, I think, at least two different players have been sent off for the Sounders for a second yellow. Very frustrating, and of course, it ultimately comes back to Balliot, and we'll sort of get into that later. But what is going on here, Tim? Why can't the Sounders get these second yellows?
I truly don't know. It feels sometimes like, in some scenarios, the home crowd creates a real or perceived advantage in terms of the way referees call games. And for the Sounders, it almost is like referees come and are like, I'm not going to be influenced by the home crowd. I'm not giving anything to the home team. That, like, maybe that's just the way that it feels, and maybe that's a real thing. I don't think there's conscious bias happening there, but it is very strange that I didn't feel like the first yellow for Laborda was that close to a dogso, just because I think they were sort of at the midfield line and the back line was all sort of in a line. So maybe the number of defenders sort of in proximity to still try to, I don't think any of them are catching Jordan if he gets out into a sprint in the open field, but that combination of things, I think the yellow made sense, but not giving the second yellow was wild.
Yeah. The second yellow there, I just in real time, I don't remember if I clocked that as quite so egregious, but on the replay, when I rewatched it yesterday, I was sort of taken aback at how obvious of a yellow that was. The announcers both called it out immediately, saying like, this has to be a yellow. What's going on here? But then really soon after that, the Whitecaps get the breakthrough. It comes on a play where in real time, to me, it looked like Snyder Brunel got fouled, but on replay, he was not. This was a clean tackle. And although you do see it given sometimes, but I think the referee rightly let that one play out. And what ends up happening is Thomas Mueller plays in Brian White, who had just come in at halftime for what amounts to a pretty easy finish, a one-touch finish in front of goal. I don't think there's really anything Stephen Fry could have done better on that. Maybe he comes out a little earlier, cuts down the angle, but he was really in no man's. It was a disaster sort of play waiting to happen once Mueller got onto it. But the Whitecaps led 1-0, and at that point felt like they had sort of the momentum.
Yeah, that goal went in, and it felt like it is the kind of goal the Sounders have given up a bunch recently, and maybe it's just, they give up one in each of the last few games or whatever, but one of the double pivot gets caught.
Yes.
On the ball, not like whether it's, stepping on it because they're trying to draw the press to open up space because they're struggling to find space to be able to play through the middle, or it just is a lack of focus or whatever the case may be. We've seen it with Christian, we've seen it with Obed, we've seen it with Snyder now. Like, they all have gotten caught at least once, and it turns into a dangerous transition opportunity. And this, again, the fullback is pushed up to get into attack because the Sounders are in possession. The remaining back line is sort of spread thin a little bit, and the turnover happens, and they're just scrambling and don't have the numbers or don't take good angles to close the passing lane or get to the eventual shooter, and it's a goal.
Right.
But
go ahead.
Just, it really did feel like the momentum was going to swing heavily to Vancouver in that moment. And fortunately it only took about a minute or two before the Sounders had an answer, and it felt like it was really going to swing for Seattle.
Yeah, so on the next kickoff, this very next kickoff, the Sounders win a corner, and on the corner, Albert Rusnak puts in a ball that Jackson Reagan gets to first. Not necessarily a great angle, but he gets it well, puts it just inside the post, and the Sounders are rolling. And then literally, as soon as they regain possession the next time, they score the go-ahead goal on really a nice play between, Paul Rothrock plays in Jesus Ferreira. Ferreira puts across the box. It gets deflected, but it falls to Albert Rusnak, who really, I think it's in real time, it looked like an easy finish. Like he just puts it away at the goal line. But in reality, he had both Takeoka and I think Laborda essentially right in front of him. Didn't really have if he just kicks it, it gets blocked. But he roofed that shot, and the Sounders are all of a sudden flying up 2-1, and Lumen Field was loud. It was going off. It felt like all of a sudden the Sounders had the momentum that they had been looking for, and it was really a nice sequence of play. I thought a really good answer by the Sounders.
Yeah, I think Rusnak really, not only for the finish, but the hustle he puts in on that late run to the back post, because in the moment, the reason that Takeoka and whichever defender it is are there to close the angle is Rusnak very nearly gets beat to that ball to even have the chance because of the way the deflection took any pace off of it. And instead, he is the first one there, and he smashes it into the only space available to him. Just I think a testament, the game as a whole, but that play in particular too, what you get from having your highest paid player available and on the field for the whole game.
Yeah. Albert Rusnak, that's it should be said, he is having, he hasn't been as healthy this year as I think everyone would have liked. He's missed a few games, but he's putting together another really good campaign. He is sitting on, I believe, 13 goals and 9 assists across all competitions. And you combine that with his total from last year, and the only player in Sounders history who has more goals and assists over a 2-year period than Rusnak, who has, I believe, 49 goals and assists over the last 2 seasons, is Obafemi Martins in 2014 and 2015. I mean, that's pretty rarefied air for a player who weirdly does not get as much respect as I feel like he deserves. Even to like this week, there was someone in the Sounder Heart Discord talking about how if in their ideal lineup, he's not sure if Rusnak is in it, which I just think is absolutely crazy. He is been, I think, they're easily their best and most consistent offensive player, really doing everything you could ask. And then later in the game, he continued to show like his flexibility. He was able to drop back into sort of a empty bucket midfield when the Sounders went to a 4-4-2, which we can talk about later. But I just have been very impressed by Albert Rusnak. I feel like this was, he's earning, he re-signed this last offseason for a DP contract, and he's really not as long as he can stay healthy, I think this is going to end up being a great bit of business for the Sounders.
Yeah, that availability is obviously the caveat, and he's been very available for Seattle prior to this season. But to suggest that, for so long people were questioning whether he deserved to be a designated player in Seattle, to have someone genuinely think that he shouldn't be in the starting lineup seems insane. Like, he is very clearly the best player on the team right now. Like,
yeah,
I don't think there's any real conversation to be had there.
No, I don't either. And I guess maybe I'm giving too much oxygen to the idea that he shouldn't be starting on this team. I just was sort of like shocked that it was even a thing anyone would really suggest, because it just seems to defy a certain logic. But then, so the Sounders didn't exactly seize control of the match at that point. It was still, a pretty open match. And Vancouver does get the equalizer in I believe it was like the 67th minute, on frankly a nice corner kick that was kind of a frustrating sequence right before it, though, because the Sounders probably could have cleared that danger a little bit more efficiently than they did. But anyway, Sebastian Berhalter puts in a nice corner. And then, of course, it's Mateus Laporta, the player who should have been sent off, who grabs who scores the header. A really nice header, it should be said, but frustrating that he was on the field to hit it.
It's always the way it goes, right? The guy who shouldn't be on the field is, of course, the one who makes the difference-making play in the end.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if he also was the person who Manungu's shot hit on the goal line in stoppage time. Like, just because it feels like that is just what happens.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So it ends up being, so we end up going towards the end, and the Sounders do switch into a 4-4-2. I think maybe the surprising part of this was that instead of bringing in Pedro de la Vega for probably Rothrock, I would assume is who he would have come in for, the Sounders elect to bring in Osaze de Rosario to play as a second striker. I guess who was he in? Must have been in place of, I guess, Snyder Brunel is who I assume who they took off for him. And so I kind of understand the broad strokes of that decision. And I think it's that Brian really just wants to see this team playing in a 4-4-2, because I think he's envisioning a matchup with someone like Minnesota United, who they have tried sort of playing straight up with the 4-2-3-1. They've tried playing 3 in the back. And I wonder if maybe they want to have this 4-4-2 in the bag, especially with the way that Danny Musovski and Jordan Moore, with the idea that I assume trying to get Danny Musovski on the field with Jordan Morris. Of course, Morris is not available at this point. And just for me, I do get the Manungu. I think the Manungu move looked like it was playing well every single time Manungu gets isolated on the wing, no matter who he's going against. I feel really good about it. But in this one, he again was sort of, he looked like he was capable of making magic happen. I just don't quite get the De Rosario thing, not because De Rosario doesn't deserve some minutes, but is it worth forcing him on the field over Pedro de la Vega? I don't think so.
I guess the only space in which I can make the argument that De Rosario in that scenario over De La Vega makes sense is that you add another very legitimate threat from set pieces or crosses into the box. But still, the way that De La Vega has been handled since becoming available with the knee tendonitis stuff just is a cause for contemplation for me, because I understand wanting to be careful with him and not wanting to overdo it given the knee tendonitis. But the longer you go not playing him, even if there are good reasons to not, that you don't like the game state or whatever, which is, I understand the reasoning behind that, but also if you are in a game state that requires you to kind of pull a goal out of nothing, we've seen that De La Vega is probably the most likely player to pull a goal out of nothing. Like, Manungo can create moments and occasionally that leads to something, but De La Vega has a better track record of pulling a rabbit out of the hat in those compact moments. And I think especially in a game where you're trying to find a way to control the game a little bit more, I think De La Vega offers you quite a bit more in that setting than either Manungu or De Rosario. I worry that the longer reintegrating him into the games gets kicked down the road, the less runway he has to be able to build up match fitness to actually be able to, play meaningful minutes, let alone start a game once you're in the playoffs.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I feel like Pedro de la Vega is their X factor. I've been sort of consistent on saying this, is that if there's one player who can lift the Sounders sort of above where you might otherwise expect them, I do really believe it's Pedro de la Vega. And we saw that in Leagues Cup. We've seen that in spurts where he is just capable of making special plays, and he forces teams to react and play differently than really anyone else on the team. And it's just kind of weird to me that he hasn't been able to get into a game despite being available at least the last two. And I'm with you. I think the biggest concern isn't so much whether or not he played in this game. It's just more the idea that he needs minutes in order to feel like they could, ideally he's starting for you in the playoffs. But if you're going to get him up to being a starter, you've got to play him some games. Like he can't, I don't want him to be starting for the first time in the playoffs for the first time in a couple months in the playoffs. And so the Sounders have 3 more games. I assume he's not going to start against Portland. We asked Brian about it today, and he said that Pedro is going to play against Portland. And Pedro looks really, really good in training. Like the last few training sessions that I've been to, and they've been playing short-sighted games, he is the standout player. I mean, he is just bagging goals left and right, and he's doing it from all sorts of angles. He's a really good player around the box. And I'll tell you, if one player who's going to give you a little bit better of a chance, it does feel like it's De La Vega. And I don't know. I just hope that this is not a sign that he's lost the trust of Brian Schmetzer, because that would be a real shame.
I have to imagine that more than having lost the coach's trust, because, you look back to the Leagues Cup final and he doesn't have a goal or an assist, but he is a huge part of why Messi has so little influence, that there is so little threat from the right side of the field. He was a nightmare for Miami on both sides of the ball and was in an absolute dogfight all game and came out the better in almost every instance. I think if they have become gun shy about using him because of the injuries, I don't know how, there's no way for him to prove the negative of I'm not going to get hurt again, because you can't guarantee that. And also, how do you prove that other than by what he's already doing?
Yeah, exactly. So that is, I would say, if there's one concern I have right now, it's maybe Pedro de la Vega just getting reintegrated into the team and feeling like really part of what's going on here. Because again, I just feel like if the Sounders are going to make a run in the playoffs, it's hard to imagine it being done without De La Vega being a significant part of that. Of course, they've also got these defensive issues, which are becoming more and harder and harder to ignore. I feel like it was probably a couple months ago we first were saying yeah, the defense isn't great, but this is the same defense that really was the league's best the last 2 years. Eventually they're going to round into form. And then they had this great Leagues Cup run where they only give up 2 goals, and you go, okay, the defense is back, but they've now given up 9 goals in 4 games since Leagues Cup. They've given up at least 2 in all 4 of those games. And I don't know if it's there's not one thing that I think you can point to beyond sort of generally set pieces they've struggled on, and then they've given up a bunch of goals on turnovers in bad parts of the field, which I don't know if is entirely fair to put on the defense, but it does speak to broader defensive issues. I am worried that this defense is just not good. This is sort of who the Sounders are defensively at this point, which is they're going to have to win. They're going to have to score multiple goals every game to have a chance of winning. The good news is that they are clearly capable of scoring multiple goals. They've done it a lot. They did it again in this game. the danger is that you're putting a lot of pressure on being extremely clinical when, you know, being clinical is not necessarily their forte.
Right. I have to wonder how much of the defensive struggle really, Schmetzer talks a lot about the whole team plays defense. It's not just that back four or back five or back six, however you look at it, but the whole team has to play defense. And particularly the way games have been going, where I think there is this often need to find additional goals, and so the team is pressing even more. The defensive strength, when this team this season has played well, is a product of pressing and repressing and winning second balls, and the more miles that stack up on the legs of the midfield in particular, the less they're able to cover as much ground, win, get into every single duel. The guys behind and around them have to push more to try to cover that ground. As they struggle to cover it, they get opened up more, and the space for other teams to play through are more present. At this point, there's not anything to really do about getting those guys rest, because you can't dictate how Obed Vargas is going to get played at the U20 World Cup. And what, are you going to not play Christian? I don't know that you really can justify that at this point in the season, unfortunately. And they just have to find a way to be more disciplined, and I don't know, hope that it goes better.
Right. Yeah, that does seem to be sort of like where they are at this point, is that it's like they just are, they kind of are what they are. I will know, I think you did pick up on a good point, though, is that, so much of their defensive success this year has been on sort of this repressing, and it oftentimes shows up in stats like average line of confrontation, because all of a sudden you're making these defensive players high, in the opposing third. And especially where we're seeing that difference, especially, is at home, where they were among the most aggressive pressing teams at home in the entire league before the League's Cup, or before the League's Cup final. And since then, they've dropped into a much more conservative approach. Both this game and the Galaxy game, they had an average line of confrontation of about 36 yards from goal, which is just like pretty league average. But before that, they had been at like 45 yards from goal, which is, you're almost at midfield at that point. That's one of the highest. So I do wonder if there is something tactically that they have started doing differently. And I do think that when this team, it's to me undeniable that this team at its best is flying all over the field and repressing and winning a lot of balls in the defensive third, even if those chances aren't turning directly into goals. That's a big part of what they do well. And I don't know what the reason for that is. I suppose part of it could be that they are working players back in, and so maybe there's just some time, and we're talking about a relatively small sample size, so you would like to think this is not some big change in philosophy, but it is. I would say if you're looking for one big difference defensively, it's just sort of their ability to win the ball in the other team's half.
Yeah, and I think some of that is also again, similar source, I think, but some difficulty really keeping the ball and playing through the middle of the field, where that's where a lot of those turnovers are happening, or, getting pressed on the wings and turning it over. And because they are often in these positions where they're trying to find the goals and the pressing structure they're taking invites the other team in more, which I think could be that theoretically that should open up additional space for you to play into and through. But when you go to capitalize that and the execution isn't clean, it turns into a turnover, and one, the other team is closer to your goal, but two, you have less ability to respond to that. It's a tough balance they have to try to strike.
Yeah,
I think instead they should just do better.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with you there. All right, well, that's probably a good place to take a break here. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more. We got an update on Alex Roldan and Yamar, and we'll go into how the Sounders are going to handle that and what to expect. You're listening to Nos Arietes. Thank you for listening to the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network, which now includes Nos Arietes, Lobbing Scorchers, and the Cooler Guild. Although this podcast is free, it's only made possible through our paid subscribers. Plans start as low as $30 a year and allow us to remain independent and mostly ad-free. Subscribers get access to all our written and podcast content, including a full-text RSS feed and a mostly ad-free podcast feed that includes every show in one spot. If you really like what we're doing, though, I'd encourage you to sign up at our higher tiers, which include all sorts of various perks. The most popular of those is our members-only Discord, where the real Sounders sickos hang out. I know I've called this group the smartest, funniest, and best-informed Sounders fans in the world, but it's more than the rough equivalent of a Sounders Mensa meeting. Discord is where we make things happen, like for real. You know the promotion the Sounders ran that offered fans the opportunity to trade in their Messi jersey for a Paul Rothrock one? That originated in our community. You'll not only be the first to know about stuff, but you also have a semi-direct line to the movers and shakers at the Sounders organization. If you want to be one of the totally normal people who occupy the Sounder at Heart Discord, just become a supporter of Sounder at Heart. Anyway, thanks for listening, and go Durs. Nos Arietes, admittedly, is not exactly known for our spicy takes, but that doesn't mean we want our food to be mild. Spice up your life with Haxon Ferments. Handcrafted in Georgetown and made with the best local ingredients from across the Pacific Northwest, they specialize in unique small batch fermented hot sauces and vinegars. Haxon Ferments brings bold flavors and natural fermentation together for something truly special. Whether you're a heat seeker or just looking to elevate your cooking, you'll find something you love at haxonferments.com. That's HAXANFERMENTS.com. And right now, if you use the code SOUNDERATHEART, that's all one word, at checkout, you will get a free hot sauce with your order. Again, go to haxonferments.com, use the code SOUNDERATHEART at checkout for a free hot sauce with your order. Haxon Ferments is a proud sponsor of the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network. Welcome back to Nos Arietes. So the big thing to come out of this game, aside from the result, were the two injuries to Yamar and Alex Roldan. And I'll admit, I assumed that both of them were probably going to be out for the rest of the regular season. And you just sort of hope and cross your fingers that they'll be back in time for the playoffs. I do think, as you know, talk about their defensive issues. These are maybe their two best defensive players, their two most consistent defensive players. And losing them both was going to be a problem. Losing one of them would be a problem. But then today we got some relatively positive news. Alex Roldan, it turns out, does not have a adductor injury, which is what we had first heard. Apparently it was more just that he turned his hip awkwardly, and he was out. He wasn't doing training, but he was outside doing work. And Brian Schmetzer actually said that there's a chance that he will be ready for Portland, but it sounds like they're not really worried about him being available beyond that. Yamar wasn't quite as good news, but it wasn't the disaster that it potentially could have been. He's going to be out for probably 4 weeks, which would put him in line to return basically right when the playoffs start. So, given that, how are you feeling about those two situations, I guess, Tim?
Obviously glad that Alex isn't going to be out for a long period of time. I think he is such an underrated piece of how the Sounders play when they are at their best, both his ability to deliver the ball from out wide, his defense is better than I think he often gets credit for, and he is an integral part of their possession game, like his distribution, his ability to tuck into midfield and serve as an added node in that double pivot allows them to use the ball more effectively. Losing Jamar is rough. I think he has not had his best season, but I think the drop from Jamar to whether it's Kim Ki-hee or John Bell starts and Jackson Reagan shifts over to the right, like I think either of those just are a pretty sizable hit to how the Sounders play. Maybe Kim Ki-hee plays more like Kim Ki-hee at his best, but that's kind of hoping for something that we haven't necessarily seen a ton to happen. That is not the kind of thing you want to have to gamble on as you're heading to the playoffs.
Yeah, I would agree with that. No, I will say with Kim, the caveat, the Sounders are 6-1-2 in his start. So they've gotten good results. I don't think they've necessarily looked as good when he's out. And I think Yamar, he might be a better replacement for Jackson in that he's a pretty good passer, but he's simply not as mobile as Yamar is. And, on the header that Vancouver get to get the equalizer on this, I can't help but feel like Yamar is maybe a little bit better at defending that than, granted, even though, yes, Danny Masofsky and Jackson Reagan were the two players who were sort of barking him up there. I don't know. I feel a little bit better if Yamar is in on set pieces. But the sort of the bigger question mark, I think, is how Kalani Kosarienzi manages, especially like, let's just talk about this week. I'm going to assume he's the starter. Now, at his best, Kalani has been nothing short of a revelation. He's got 3 goals and 2 assists in about 1,200 MLS minutes. He has, he is a dynamic player. He gets up and down the line really well. And when he sort of can get into the game, he's really effective. And I do think that Portland is probably a good matchup for him because they are not going to play sort of like, they're not going to press him and sort of out tactic him. And I do think the teams that he struggles with are like the more technical teams, the teams like the Whitecaps, who have, frankly, a really good defensive structure, and they have a real good system for attacking. Whereas the Timbers are a little bit more of a sort of like get the talented guys on the ball type of offense, at least to my eye. But Kalani is, this was not his best game. He has not necessarily been at his best since, Leagues Cup. We haven't really seen a great game from him since Leagues Cup. But, at his best, he I think arguably is, his best games have arguably been better than Alex's best games, at least offensively. I don't know. Maybe that's overstating it. Alex has been really good this year.
I think Alex has had a couple, he had the 2 assist and a goal performance. I think Alex's best games are more well-rounded and have higher highs, but considering Kosarienzi's age and experience, I think when he shines particularly brightly. I think this Timbers matchup is one where it's pretty tailored for his game in particular. I think
famous last words and all, but I agree.
Sure. I knock on wood, but I think the left side center back and fullback pairing from Portland seems like a pairing that would have trouble dealing with Kosarienzi making overlapping runs. I think he could do a good job just being a harrying presence on that right side in defense. I am not too concerned about that. I also think for all that Kim, instead of Jamar, sort of exacerbates some of the team's biggest defensive frailties. Just he isn't as athletic or fast. I don't know that that's necessarily as much of a concern against the Timbers as some other teams. Not that he isn't going to need to be athletic or fast, but I just don't think that's quite as much the way that the Timbers play, and there aren't as direct of threats as there would be with some other teams. So I think, it's a good opportunity for both players, I think. But we'll just have to see how it plays out.
Yeah. As far as the matchup goes, Kamal Miller apparently has been getting most of the starts at left back for Portland. And that does seem, like you said, that seems to be a good matchup potentially for Kalani, because he shouldn't have to worry about defending too much. Miller essentially plays for the most part, he plays as a third as a third center back, and Mosquera does almost plays as a wing back really in that formation. So, I suspect that's, like you said, that's probably a good matchup. And I don't know. I do like their chances there. I guess I'm not freaking out about Alex. If there was one game that Alex is going to miss, this is probably as good as any of them. And we'll see about Kim. I think, if he can get them through, if he can just get them through, if the Sounders can get 6 points from these last 2 or last 3 games, I feel like I'm going to feel pretty good about their playoff hopes. And especially if one of those wins needs to be Portland. I feel like we've been saying this for almost a decade, but they got to figure out how to beat Portland at home. This is ridiculous.
It is worryingly close to a decade, but first time always has to happen eventually.
It does, right? It's the gambler's fallacy, but the Sounders are really due to win a home game against the Timbers, which I feel
Absolutely.
like literally, I've said that a lot of times, but every time it's true. It's true every single time.
Could we get national media to talk as much as possible about the fact that the Timbers haven't lost at Lumen in 8 years, just because that seems like the kind of thing that we could trick them into jinxing so that the Timbers do lose?
I think that's a great idea. It's a fantastic idea, Tim.
We've got to get the friends of the pod working.
Exactly. We're going to have to start put the word out, get Soccer Wise, get Total Soccer Show, get let's see who else get out there. I'm sure we can come up with a few more that just.
I feel like we could get Doyle to hammer that on Blue Sky. Get Charles Boehm.
There we go. Exactly. Get this out there. Tell your buddies that the Timbers have never lost at Lumen Field, because it's we need that out in the world. All right. Well, Tim, thank you for filling in for Aaron. I really appreciate it. Of course, thank you to Lickit for producing the show. Thank you to our sponsors, Hacks and Ferments and Full Pull Wines, for keeping this thing going. And of course, thank you to our very, very loyal listeners. Hopefully, if you are a subscriber to Sounder at Heart, hopefully you've heard about these stickers that we made. We made one for Schmetzer High Life, and we've got Paul Rothrock in the shape of the Washington State flag. So hopefully, if you are a subscriber, and you want one of those, you've figured out how to order it. With all that said, I am Jeremiah Oshan, signing off for Nos Audietes, which is part of the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network. Remember, you'll never get alone.
let's go f***ing Sounders.